I'm sorry for your loss. How did you know my husband?
Your husband, Raymond, is my husband.
There's a particular kind of grief that arrives at a funeral. Most people know what it looks like. The black clothes, the quiet voices, the flowers that cost too much and mean too little. The way people who have not seen each other in years suddenly find themselves standing very close together, because loss has a way of collapsing the distance between people who share it. But there's another kind of grief that almost nobody talks about. The kind that arrives not when you lose someone, but when you realize, standing at their grave, that the person you're grieving was never entirely the person you thought they were. That is the kind of grief that visited two women on a Tuesday morning in October at a cemetery outside of Memphis, Tennessee. One of those women was 41 years old. She had driven 6 hours to be there. She had prepared a eulogy. She had chosen the flowers. She had spent the previous week making phone calls and funeral arrangements, and the thousand exhausting decisions that fell to the person who was closest to the person who died. She believed, without any reason to question it, that she was the closest person. And then she arrived at the graveside, and she saw a woman she had never seen before in her life, standing on the other side of that grave with red eyes and a black dress, and the particular posture of someone who had also lost something enormous. And that woman looked at her and said, quietly and with complete confusion, "I am so sorry for your loss. How did you know my husband? Stay with me." Because what unraveled over the 72 hours that followed is something that no one in either family has ever fully recovered from. And it started with those 8 words. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you're not already subscribed to Behind the Lie, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened at that cemetery on that Tuesday morning in October, you need to understand the man at the center of it. You need to understand how a person builds two complete lives simultaneously for over 2 decades without either life ever touching the other. You need to understand the particular kind of discipline and compartmentalization that requires the daily decisions, the careful management of calendars and phone calls and explanations, the sheer sustained effort of maintaining two versions of yourself across two households in two different cities for longer than some people's marriages last in total. And when you understand all of that, you're going to be left with the same question that everyone who hears this story eventually arrives at. Not how he did it, but why. Why did a man who had everything most people spend their whole lives working toward decide that one life was not enough, and spend the next 22 years making sure that the two women who loved him most would never find out that the other one existed? The answer to that question is the heart of this story, and it is more complicated and more devastating than you might expect. The man's name, for the purposes of this story, was Raymond. He was 63 years old when he died. He died on a Wednesday afternoon in early October from a heart attack that his doctor said was not entirely unexpected given his blood pressure history and the fact that Raymond had, by his own admission at his last checkup, not been taking his medication as prescribed. He died in his car in the parking lot of a grocery store in Memphis, Tennessee, which is perhaps not the dramatic exit that a man who had managed as complex a life as Raymond's had managed might have wished for, but death rarely consults our preferences about timing or setting. A woman who had been loading her groceries into the car beside him noticed that he had not moved for several minutes and called 911. The paramedics arrived within 7 minutes. Raymond was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 63 years old. He had two families, and neither of them knew about the other. The first family was in Memphis. The woman at the center of it was named Gloria. She was 58 years old, a retired elementary school librarian who had spent 30 years introducing children to books and believed, as people who love books tend to believe, that every story worth telling had to be honest to be worth anything at all. She and Raymond had been married for 31 years. They had two grown children together, a son named Andre who was 28 and worked as an electrician in Nashville, and a daughter named Simone who was 26 and had just completed her first year teaching middle school science in Memphis. Gloria and Raymond had a house in a quiet neighborhood in East Memphis with a vegetable garden in the backyard that Raymond tended on weekends when he was home, and a front porch where they drank coffee together on Sunday mornings, and 31 years of the particular accumulated intimacy that comes from sharing a life with someone through every season it passes through. Gloria knew Raymond's shoe size and the way he took his coffee and the specific sound of his breathing when he had fallen into a deep sleep. She knew which of his old stories were true and which ones had been improved by repetition. She knew that he cried at certain movies and always pretended afterward that he had not. She thought she knew everything about him. She did not know that every Tuesday and Thursday of his working life for the past 22 years, Raymond had not been where he said he was. Raymond worked as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, a job that required, by its nature, a significant amount of travel. He covered a territory that included Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, which meant that being away from home several days a week was not just plausible, but expected, professionally documented, and entirely unremarkable to anyone who knew him. Gloria had lived with Raymond's travel schedule for so long that it had become simply the shape of their life together. She was a woman who was comfortable in her own company, who had her own friendships and her own routines and her own full life that did not require Raymond's constant presence to be meaningful. She missed him when he was gone. She was glad when he came home. She trusted him with the complete and unexamined trust of a woman who had been given, over 31 years, no specific reason not to. That is the important detail. Raymond was not sloppy. He did not leave evidence. He did not make the kinds of mistakes that people who conduct secret lives make when they are careless or arrogant or simply not smart enough to maintain the discipline the deception requires. Raymond was careful. Raymond was methodical. Raymond had been doing this for 22 years, and in 22 years, not a single thing had slipped. The second family was in Jackson, Mississippi, 90 miles south of Memphis on Interstate 55, a drive that Raymond could complete in under 2 hours and had completed, by any reasonable estimate, hundreds of times. The woman at the center of this family was named Cheryl. She was 44 years old, a dental hygienist who had been working at the same practice in Jackson for 15 years. She was warm and practical and deeply loved by everyone who knew her. The kind of woman who brought food to neighbors when they were sick and remembered the names of her friends' children and kept her promises without being asked twice. She and Raymond had met at a conference in Atlanta in 2001. He had told her early in their relationship that he had been married before and that the marriage had ended badly and that he did not talk about it because there was nothing useful to say about something that had caused that much pain. Cheryl had respected this. She had not pressed. She was a woman who believed that people had the right to their own private grief, and she loved Raymond for the person he was with her, not for the complete biography she had never been given. They had been together for 3 years before Raymond asked her to marry him at a restaurant in downtown Jackson on a Tuesday evening after a sales call that had kept him in the area through the end of the week. Cheryl said yes. They were married in a small ceremony at a chapel in Jackson with 40 guests. Raymond told Gloria he had a 4-day conference in Nashville. He had a hotel room booked in Nashville for 4 days. He had receipts from Nashville restaurants on his credit card statement for those 4 days. He was in Jackson, Mississippi, marrying another woman. And then he drove home. Raymond and Cheryl had one child together, a daughter named Brianna, who was 19 years old at the time of Raymond's death and had just started her second year at a community college in Jackson. Brianna had grown up knowing her father as a man who traveled constantly for work, who was home on certain weekends and absent for long stretches during the week, who called every night he was away without fail and remembered every detail of her life, and showed up to every school play and every parent-teacher conference and every single thing that required his presence as a father. She adored him. She had never questioned the travel. She had grown up with it as the simple, unchanging fact of what her father's life looked like, the same way that Raymond's children in Memphis had grown up with it, in an entirely parallel and entirely unknowing way, in a house 90 miles north. Two families, two sets of children who had grown up calling the same man dad. Two women who had built their lives around the same man's presence and absence. And one man who had stood at the center of all of it for 22 years, maintaining the precise balance of a person who had decided at some point so long ago that perhaps even he could not remember exactly when, that the only way to have the life he wanted was to build two of them and never let them meet. The call that told Gloria that Raymond was dead came at 4:17 in the afternoon on that Wednesday in October. It came from a Memphis police officer who had been given her name from Raymond's wallet. She was in the kitchen when her phone rang. She was making dinner. She has said in the weeks since that she remembers exactly what she was doing, exactly what song was playing on the radio, exactly what the light looked like through the window above the sink, the way people always remember the precise details of the moment that divides their life into before and after. She called Andre first. Then she called Simone. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and did not move for a very long time. Simone drove over immediately and stayed the night. Andre drove down from Nashville the following morning. The three of them began making arrangements that same week because that is what families do in the days after a sudden death. They move through the practical necessities of loss because the practical necessities give the grief somewhere to go when it is too large to simply sit with. Gloria chose the funeral home. She chose the casket. She wrote the obituary herself, sitting at Raymond's desk in the small study off the living room, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of 31 years of a shared life. The framed photographs and the bookmarked novels and the coffee mug he had used every morning that was still sitting on the desk where he had left it the last time he was home. She wrote a beautiful obituary. It described a devoted husband and a loving father and a man of integrity who had spent his life showing up for the people he loved. She meant every word of it. She had no idea that 90 miles south, another woman was writing another obituary about the same man. Cheryl found out about Raymond's death from a phone call she received at 6:45 that same Wednesday evening. It came from a colleague of Raymond's who had her number from a company emergency contact form that Raymond had filled out for his Jackson address, a form that listed Cheryl as his wife and next of kin for that region. The colleague had been trying to reach Raymond all afternoon and had finally escalated to the emergency contact. Cheryl answered. She listened. She thanked the person on the phone. She hung up. She sat down on the kitchen floor of her house in Jackson, and she stayed there for a long time while Brianna, who was home for the week, sat beside her and held her hand without knowing what else to do. Cheryl called Raymond's cell phone 3 times after that, some involuntary response of a mind that has not yet accepted what it has been told. And each time it went to voicemail in the particular way that a dead person's phone goes to voicemail, full and present and completely unreachable. She began making her own arrangements. She contacted Raymond's employer. She reached out to the funeral home in Memphis that the company had listed as the point of contact for arrangements. And that is where the first crack in the wall appeared, because the woman at the funeral home who answered Cheryl's call paused for a moment that was slightly too long before saying, carefully, that she would need to take a message and have someone call her back, because the arrangements had already been made by Raymond's wife, the other one. What followed over the next 48 hours before the funeral was a series of conversations between people who were trying to manage an impossible situation with as much dignity as the situation allowed. The funeral home director, who had been in the business for 23 years and had seen most of what human life could produce in its most difficult moments, told an interviewer much later that she had never encountered anything quite like those 2 days. She had spoken to Gloria, who at that point had been told only that another woman had called claiming a connection to Raymond and needed to be contacted. She had spoken to Cheryl, who by that point had begun to understand, from the careful language the funeral home director was using, that the situation was significantly more complicated than a grieving colleague trying to pay her respects. She had spoken to Raymond's employer, who confirmed that Raymond had listed 2 different home addresses in 2 different cities on 2 different sets of HR paperwork over the course of his employment. And she had made the decision, which she later said was the hardest professional decision of her career, to contact both women and let them know the truth before the funeral, because the alternative, letting them both arrive at the graveside without knowing, was something she was not willing to be responsible for. She called Gloria on the Thursday evening before the Saturday funeral. She told her, as gently as she could, what she had learned. Gloria was silent for a very long time. Then she said, in a voice that the funeral home director described as the quietest voice she had ever heard a human being use while receiving devastating information, "How long?" The funeral home director said she did not know. Gloria said, "Thank you for telling me." And she hung up. Gloria did not sleep that Thursday night. She sat in the small study off the living room, at Raymond's desk, surrounded by the same photographs and books and the same coffee mug she had been looking at when she wrote his obituary, and she began to look at her life from the outside, which is the particular and terrible work that people do in the hours after they have been told something that rewrites everything they thought they knew. She went through 31 years in her mind, not looking for evidence she had missed, not reconstructing a case against a man who was no longer alive to answer for himself, but simply sitting with the weight of what she now knew and trying to understand how it fit inside the life she had actually lived. Because that is the question that people in Gloria's situation always eventually arrive at, and it is the question that has no clean answer. Does the discovery that someone lied change the truth of what you experienced? Does knowing that Raymond had another family, another wife, another daughter in a city 90 miles away erase the 31 years of a life that was also real, also genuine, also full of the ordinary and extraordinary accumulation of 2 people building something together? Gloria did not have an answer to that question on Thursday night. She is not sure she has a complete answer to it today, but she made a decision before the sun came up on Friday morning. She decided that she was going to the funeral. She was going to bury her husband, and she was going to do it with the same dignity and composure with which she had done everything else in her life, because she was Gloria, and she had been raised by a woman who told her that how you behave in your worst moments is the truest measure of who you are. Cheryl received her own phone call from the funeral home director on that same Thursday evening, approximately 2 hours after Gloria's call. By this point, Cheryl had already begun to piece together fragments of a picture that she had been given no reason to construct until now, the kind of retroactive understanding that arrives when a piece of information falls into place that suddenly makes 100 other things make sense in a way they had never quite made sense before. She had spent the previous day and a half making calls and reaching people in Raymond's professional network. And in several of those calls, she had encountered pauses and careful language, and the particular evasiveness of people who knew something they did not want to be the one to say. When the funeral home director told her, Cheryl said later that her first response was not anger and not grief, and not the shocked disbelief that most people would assume was the natural reaction. Her first response was a question. She asked, "Does she know about Brianna?" The funeral home director said yes. Cheryl was silent for a moment. Then she said, "My daughter lost her father 3 days ago. She is 19 years old. She's going to bury him on Saturday. And I'm not going to let anything turn that into something it should not be." Then she asked for Gloria's phone number. Whether Gloria and Cheryl spoke directly before the funeral is something that neither woman has confirmed publicly. What is known is that both women arrived at the cemetery on that Saturday morning, and that the moment they came face to face across that grave is the moment that this story shifts from the account of a deception into something more complex and more human, and ultimately more important than the deception itself. Gloria was standing with Andre and Simone when Cheryl arrived with Brianna. The 2 women looked at each other across the open grave with a particular expressiveness of people who have been told everything important there is to know about a situation and are now meeting the reality of it for the first time. Cheryl was younger than Gloria had expected. Gloria was more composed than Cheryl had been prepared for. Brianna was holding her mother's arm with the tight grip of a young woman who understood that something was happening around her that was larger than anything she had been given away to process. Andre and Simone stood close to their mother and said nothing. The other guests, the colleagues and neighbors and church friends who had come to pay their respects to Raymond and had no idea that the graveside they were standing around contained a revelation that would be discussed in the homes of everyone present for years to come, watched with the silent attention of people who understand that something significant is happening but do not yet know what it is. The funeral proceeded. The pastor who had known Raymond from his Memphis church spoke with warmth about the man he had known, the man who showed up reliably every Sunday when he was in town, who tithed consistently, who volunteered twice a year for the church's community food drive, who had a way of making people feel seen and valued in his presence. Every word the pastor said was true of the Raymond he had known. Every word was also incomplete in a way the pastor could not have known. Gloria delivered the eulogy she had written at Raymond's desk on a morning that still felt like it belonged to a different version of her life. She stood at the podium and she read what she had written about devotion and longevity and the particular grace of a man who showed up, and every person listening heard those words with a different kind of weight than she had intended when she wrote them, because by now the knowledge had spread through the assembled guests the way knowledge always spreads in a close community, in whispers and exchanged glances, and the particular charge that fills a room when everyone is thinking about the same thing that nobody is saying out loud. Gloria read every word she had written. Her voice did not break. When she finished, she folded the paper, returned to her seat, and sat with her children, and she did not look across the grave. Cheryl did not speak at the funeral. She had decided that it was not her place to speak at a ceremony that Gloria had organized, in a church community that Gloria and Raymond had shared, among people who had known them as a couple for 3 decades. But when the burial was complete and the guests began to move toward their cars, Cheryl walked around the grave to where Gloria was standing with Andre and Simone. She stopped in front of Gloria. She said, later, that she had prepared nothing to say and that she still does not know exactly where the words came from. She said, "I did not know. I want you to know that I did not know. And I am sorry that any of this is part of the story of your life, because you deserved better than this. And so did your children." Gloria looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "So did yours." And then Gloria put her arms around Cheryl, briefly, in the way that two people who have been through the same disaster sometimes hold each other, not out of warmth or forgiveness or any emotion that has a clean name, but out of the simple human recognition that they're the only two people in the world who understand exactly what the other one is carrying. Brianna, who was standing behind her mother, began to cry for the first time since her father had died. Andre, who had been watching the exchange with his jaw tight and his hands in his pockets, turned away and looked at the sky for a long time. Simone reached for his arm, and Raymond lay in the ground between them all, taking his secrets with him the way people who keep secrets for 22 years apparently always intend to, all the way to the end. The 72 hours that followed the funeral were the hardest hours of this story, not because of what happened publicly, but because of what happened privately in the homes of two families who were now separately and simultaneously doing the same work of going through a life and finding out what was real and what was constructed. Gloria went through Raymond's study the Sunday after the funeral, with Andre and Simone beside her, the way families go through a person's belongings when they're trying to account for a life. She found what she had expected to find, and she found what she had not. There were the documents of their shared life, the mortgage papers and the insurance policies and the tax returns and the small accumulated paperwork of 31 years. And there were other documents, a second insurance policy, a set of bank statements for an account she did not recognize, receipts from Jackson, Mississippi, a folder at the back of the bottom drawer containing photographs of a woman and a girl at various stages of the girl's childhood, from infancy through what appeared to be a high school graduation. Raymond, in several of those photographs, younger, his hair darker, his smile exactly as Gloria had always known it. Standing in a kitchen she did not recognize with his arm around a woman who was not her. Standing at a school play with a little girl in a costume sitting on his knee. Standing at what appeared to be a birthday party, a cake with candles, a child blowing them out. Raymond's face illuminated by the candlelight with an expression that Gloria recognized without wanting to, because it was the same expression she had seen on his face at their own children's birthday parties, at every moment of uncomplicated joy in their shared life. It was the expression of a man who loved his child. It did not help her. It did not make it easier. But it was undeniably real, and Gloria was a woman who had spent 58 years committed to looking at reality, even when reality was not what she had wanted to find. Cheryl's parallel process of discovery was no less devastating and in some ways more disorienting, because what Cheryl was discovering was not the evidence of a secret life she had known nothing about, but the degree to which the life she had believed was real had been constructed around a foundation she had never been allowed to examine. She found, in Raymond's belongings at their Jackson home, a box that he had kept in the back of the closet in their bedroom that she had never opened because Raymond had told her it contained work documents, and she had had no reason not to believe him. The box did not contain work documents. It contained 31 years of a Memphis marriage, the wedding photographs, the birth certificates of 2 children whose names she had never heard, anniversary cards written in Gloria's handwriting, a photo from what appeared to be a family vacation, Raymond and Gloria and 2 small children at what looked like a beach somewhere, laughing at something outside the frame, entirely at ease, entirely a family. Cheryl sat on the floor of their bedroom in Jackson, Mississippi, with that photograph in her hands, and she thought about the same thing that Gloria had been thinking about 90 miles north at the same moment, which was the question that has no clean answer. What is real? If the love was real and the deception was also real, if the life was genuinely lived and also genuinely false, if the man who sat across from you at dinner for 20 years was both the person you knew and a person you had never met, then what exactly do you grieve? What exactly have you lost? And is the loss larger or smaller for knowing the truth, now that there is no one left to ask? Raymond's employer conducted an internal review in the weeks following his death, as companies tend to do when a long-term employee's personal situation creates potential legal and financial exposure. They discovered that Raymond had submitted expense reports listing hotel stays in both cities on the same dates, a logistical impossibility that had apparently never been caught because the reports were processed by different regional administrators who had no reason to compare notes. They discovered that Raymond had used 2 different sets of contact information across his employment records in a way that suggested deliberate management rather than administrative error. They made the decision, in consultation with their legal department, to make a settlement available to both families in recognition of the company's inadvertent role in facilitating the deception. The settlement terms are confidential. What is not confidential, because both women have spoken about it publicly and separately, is that the settlement was not the thing that mattered. The settlement was a number on a piece of paper. What mattered was everything else. Gloria has said in the months since Raymond's death that she has had to make a decision about how to hold 2 things simultaneously. The first thing is that she was deceived systematically and completely for 22 of the 31 years she was married to Raymond, and that the life she believed she was living was constructed on a foundation she had never been given the opportunity to examine or consent to. The second thing is that the life itself was real. Her children are real. Her marriage, in all the ways she experienced it, was real. The 31 years of Sunday morning coffee on the front porch and a vegetable garden in the backyard and the specific sound of another person's breathing in the night were real. She has said that she refuses to let the deception consume the life, because the life is hers, not Raymond's, and Raymond is no longer here to take anything else from her. She has said this with the composed directness of a woman who has done an enormous amount of thinking and arrived somewhere not at peace exactly, but at a kind of firm and clear-eyed acceptance that is perhaps the most honest response available to a situation that has no good options. Her children, Andre and Simone, are each somewhere on their own road through it. Andre has said very little publicly. Simone has said that she thinks about Brianna sometimes, a young woman who grew up in a parallel version of her own childhood, raised by the same father in a different city, and that she does not know what to do with that thought except to hold it carefully and try not to let it become something that makes her smaller rather than something that eventually, somehow, makes her larger. Cheryl has said that the hardest conversation of her life was the one she had with Brianna in the days after the funeral. Brianna was 19. She had just lost her father, and she was now being asked to absorb the information that the father she had lost had also been the father of two other people she had never met, in a family she had never known existed, in a city 90 miles from the house where she grew up. Cheryl has said that she sat with her daughter for a long time before she said anything, and that when she finally spoke, she said only this: "Your father loved you." That part was real. Everything else is something we're going to have to figure out how to carry, and we're going to figure out together, but the love was real. Whether that is enough, whether love that is real can coexist with deception that is also real, whether a man can be genuinely both things at the same time, a loving father and a sustained lie, is a question that Brianna is 19 years old and still working toward an answer to. She has time. She has her mother. And she has the particular resilience of a young woman who was raised by someone like Cheryl, which is to say someone who shows up, who keeps her promises, who does not disappear, and who tells the truth even when the truth is the hardest thing in the room. There is a detail in this story that the people who know it well always mention last, because it is the detail that lands differently depending on where you are in your own relationship with the question of what we owe the people we love. In Raymond's jacket pocket, the jacket he was wearing when he died in the parking lot of that Memphis grocery store, there were two things. The first was his wallet, which contained his driver's license and his credit cards, and a worn photograph of Gloria and their children from what appeared to be at least 15 years earlier. The second was his phone, which when unlocked showed a text conversation with Cheryl from earlier that same day, in which he had written, 2 hours before his heart stopped, that he was thinking about her and that he loved her and that he would call that evening. He did not call that evening. He was never going to call that evening. The phone sat in an evidence bag at the Memphis police station for 4 days before it was returned to Gloria with the rest of his belongings. Whether she unlocked it, whether she read it, whether she needed to read it to know what she would find, is something she has never said publicly. There are things that belong only to the person who experienced them. And Gloria, who spent 31 years living inside a story that was only partially hers, has earned the right to keep whatever parts of it she chooses. So here is what I want to leave you with today. There's a question that every person who hears this story eventually asks, and it is the question I want to place in front of you before we close. Not the obvious question, which is how. Not even the question of why, though that one is worth sitting with for a long time. The question I want to ask you is this. When you think about the two women standing at that grave, each one carrying the weight of a truth she had just been handed and had no map for, which one do you think had it harder? The woman who had 31 years of a real life that turned out to be built on something she had never been told about? Or the woman who had 20 years of a real life that turned out to be built on a lie she had been told directly and had chosen to believe because she had been given no reason not to? They are not the same wound. They are not the same grief. But they arrived at the same grave on the same morning, and they found each other across it, and they chose to see each other, and that choice is the only thing in this entire story that Raymond did not plan and did not control and did not manage. That choice belonged entirely to them, and it is, in the end, the most important thing that happened. Tell me in the comments what you think. I read every single one. And subscribe to Behind the Lie and turn on that notification bell, because next time we're going into the story of a woman who spent 15 years raising a child she did not know was not hers, and what happened when the truth arrived not from a person but from a piece of paper, a letter left behind by a woman who had died and decided, from wherever she had gone, that someone still living deserved to know the truth. We will see you there.